today until 4 p.m. Thanks for being here. My name is Megan Wiley. I'm with Sacramento State University providing facilitation support. And we also have staff from California Strategic Growth Council providing staff support in the room for anybody who likes to show up in person. We've got Camille Frazier and Caleb Swanson. And from her home office, Tessa Salzman. I'm going to do roll call to establish quorum in a quick second, but first run through our usual participation guidelines applicable to all of our task force meetings. We are fostering a space of mutual respect, mutual sharing, and cross-learning. Lots of different ideas get shared in this space, so we have an agreement to respect all different perspectives. And also this last one is important to stay on point, so our conversations today will be focused on the grants and resources subtopic. Public comment. We've got a couple of folks joining us on Zoom today. We've got a couple public comment sessions scheduled after each agendized session, plus a general public comment session at the end. If you're interested and you would like to share with the task force members, you can complete a form over here at sgc.ca.gov/meetings-events. Or you can also just use your raised hand in the Zoom tool and we'll know that you want to say hello, and we'll offer you to unmute and share your comment with the task force members. I can provide a little more guidance on that too when we get to the appropriate moment, so you don't have to memorize this. The screen comes up a couple times. And back to Zoom tips, at the bottom of your toolbar, you should be able to find a raised hand. I also should update this graphic. I think most everyone's transitioned over to the heart icon. You have to open up that heart icon to find the raised hand. It's there. Today we have a chat so we can share out information. Sometimes you'll see Q&A pop up, but that's really just for us to share out information to you all. All of the conversation, all the dialogue happens in this virtual room, so to speak. All right, what's our plan for our 2 hours together? Welcome. And we've got to review and approve the January subcommittee meeting summary. Then our first session is grant programs, research results, and discussion. Staff have been quite busy working on some of the research requests, and so we've got a lot to share there and report out. Then we'll move into a working session and carry on some of our conversations that the full task force initiated back in February, and then most recently at our March 27th full task force meeting. So we've got a couple of recommendations pertinent to grants and resources that we want to check in on, and also check in on work that has been being conducted by the working groups affiliated with the subcommittee. And before we click off, reviewing action items and confirming next steps, and making space at the end for general public comment if anyone is interested. Okay, quick roll call to establish quorum. Please unmute yourself, task force members, when I call your name, and say here. Member Doria Robinson.
Here.
Member Thea Rittenhouse.
Here.
Member James Nakahara.
Here.
Okay, quorum is established. Not with us this afternoon yet is member Leah Schwartzman. If Leah shows up, we will read her into the record. Okay, first item of business, approval of the January 9th, 2024 meeting summary. This was distributed a while ago in January and is available on our project website. Any proposed revisions by subcommittee members to this draft summary, please let me know if you would like me to bring it up on screen. Okay, hearing none. Any public comment associated with the draft January meeting summary?
There is no public comment.
Okay, may I have a motion to approve the January summary as written?
I move to approve the summary as written. I beat you to it.
We'll take the motion, the first motion by member Robinson, and how about a second by member Nakahara?
Sounds good.
All right, let's roll call. Please say aye if you agree. Member Robinson?
Aye.
Member Nakahara?
Aye.
Member Rittenhouse?
Aye.
Motion carries. The meeting will be finalized as written, and we'll get that distributed and posted to the website.
Just a really quick note there is that should have said 2025. Just
so it's just
so that the record is clear for any public Okay, sorry, continue forward.
Okay, thank you for that, Camille. Okay, let's get into it. Grant programs research. Tessa, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Megan. All right, so I think the bulk of our meeting today is going to be focused on the discussion around the grant programs research. I'm going to walk through our results right now and just kind of give an overview of what we found. Questions, of course, are okay throughout, but we'll also have time at the end to discuss. And for any task force members who are following along, subcommittee members who are following along, just wanted to note to make sure that you are looking at the most recent version of the document, the summary of results that we sent this morning. So make sure that's the document you have in front of you. And for folks online, those meeting materials will be up shortly.
Pardon me, Tessa?
Mm-hmm.
Just welcoming member Leah Schwartzman to the meeting.
Okay.
Hi, Leah.
We are just starting to discuss the grant program research results. Okay, so yeah, just some context and kind of just to remind you all of where this research is coming from. The purpose that was identified back in September, I believe it was, at a previous subcommittee meeting, was to better understand how existing programs are contributing to equitable land access and acquisition. And so we selected 12 programs from the larger resource list that is, it's called Resource List Land Access and Equity Programs. That's the spreadsheet we shared about a year ago and is public. And we selected 12 programs from that list based on a couple of criteria. And those criteria were that these programs were government administered with a focus on state programs, that they were available to applicants in California, and then that the programs directly funded land access as measured by acres transitioned. So the goal was to look at that among other metrics. And so we selected those programs, which largely focused on acquisition and conservation of land. And like I said, you all probably remember, we discussed the metrics that we were going to look into. And so some of those were eligible applicants and activities of these grant programs, applicant demographics, different set-asides for priority communities, language access. We looked into data on applicants and awarded projects, kind of side by side to get at subscription rates. And then acres impacted, among other metrics that we'll report out on. And so staff began with some desk research and really got to the point where this level of detail was, we realized it was going to be inaccessible to kind of glean all of that just online. So we developed this questionnaire for the program leads and we sent that out. And we asked for those metrics that we developed, that you all developed as a subcommittee, and asked for the 5 most recent years of funding from each grant program. So you can go to the next slide, Megan. And so here are the programs that responded. We ended up hearing back from 9 of the 12 programs in varying degrees of detail. 2 of the Wildlife Conservation Board programs were combined into a single response because that's just the way that they kind of manage their programs and their data. So we ended up with 8 programs or program responses. And then you can see that we didn't end up getting a response from the 3 programs down below. And then in general, these programs fund land acquisition and conservation easements, like I just mentioned, both for agriculture and non-agricultural conservation activities. The exception is CDFA's Urban Ag Grant Program. We did include it anyway, just to ensure that there was a consideration of urban ag, but that program mostly focuses on capacity building and then supporting other important farming activities for urban farmers. But just noting that that's somewhat of an outlier. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so one more sort of intro slide here before we get into the actual results. What can this data tell us? We gathered a lot of valuable and interesting information, lots of details about each program. But of course, there are some limitations just based on the type of data we were collecting and what's available. So I wanted to note that only one program collected demographic data, and that was on a voluntary basis. Doria, I'm seeing your hand. Yeah, do you have a question? You can feel free to jump in.
I'm sorry, I just wanted I had a question when I was reading over the report about when you say that they funded land acquisition and conservation easements. Are you saying that they're just funding the easement? Or are you saying they're funding both land acquisition and conservation easements?
It depends on the program. So I think I have the numbers in there. I believe it's 7 out of 8 grant programs fund conservation easements as one eligible activity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was 5, but let's look at the write-up, or I think might get into it. Then 5 of those 7 also fund acquisition of fee title to land. So that would be purchasing the land.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't.
No, not at all. There's a ton in there.
Yeah.
So some programs do both, some programs do one or the other. Yeah, that's totally fine. There's a lot of numbers in there. Okay, so yeah, limited demographic data essentially is what I was getting at there. Then each program shared out in a slightly different format and level of detail. Some programs, for example, reported acreage by awarded project, and then some programs only reported at sort of a higher generalized level of aggregate acreage per year of funding. And so just kind of noting that, it means that you can't actually see the individual size of each project that was funded in this set of programs that we're looking at. And then some programs reported out on different years just based on their funding cycles.
No worries, I'll do that.
Sorry? Oh, no, okay. Then the other note about this level of data that we received is that based on so much of the funding going towards organizations, it's unclear who benefits kind of as the ultimate user of that land, especially when we're talking about working lands or agriculture. So in some cases, like a tribal nation could be the steward of the land, but may not be the primary applicant. And then finally, this match funding point was really important. Some agencies encourage match funding, others maybe don't encourage it, but that's still part of the larger picture. And so the funding that they reported would be towards a project of X acres, but it doesn't mean that the funding that they reported contributing to that project was the full amount that was required to buy that piece of land or parcel. So it was tempting to do dollars invested per acre acquired, but that wasn't really possible because of that limitation. It wasn't accurate, I should say. Okay, and so then as you can see, the total projects that were reported out to us by these 8 programs was 456 across 23 funding cycles. And that's really just to note what we're talking about today without making too many generalizations outside of that set of projects. You can go to the next slide, Megan. Okay, so here's an overview of who is eligible and for which activities across these programs. You can see all programs had California Native American tribes as eligible applicants, and separately nonprofits also as eligible applicants for each of these 8 programs. 6 of the programs included government agencies, and then also sort of some programs listed very specific different agencies, such as resource conservation districts, regional parks or open space authorities, groundwater sustainability agencies, etc. And then 1 program allowed for-profit businesses to apply as an eligible applicant. A couple more details that are in that summary is that of these 456 projects, an estimated more or less 57 grants were awarded to tribal nations or tribal serving nonprofits. And then 7 were awarded to for-profit businesses, And so the balance of about 392 were awarded to nonprofits or public agencies. So the large majority there to nonprofits and public agencies. So then what projects are eligible for these programs? We kind of just got into it a minute ago, but 7 of the 8 programs fund easement acquisitions. So the acquisition of an easement. 5 programs fund the acquisition of fee title, so basically purchasing the land. 5 programs also supported planning and capacity building activities as sort of one aspect of their grant program, and then 1 program, urban farming activities. And yeah, just to note in the reporting, some programs, to Doria, to your point, some programs reported out on this acquisition as a funding category separate. So some broke it out like this many dollars were spent on acquisition of easements, this many dollars were spent on acquisition of fee title, while others actually combine those 2 as one funding category. Go ahead to the next slide, Megan. Okay, so here we get into the question. This is table 1 in the document. What are the impacts of these programs and projects that were analyzed? So based on the data that was shared with us, 331 of those projects were associated with acres impacted. So those were the acquisition projects. We removed the capacity building projects and urban ag activities from this specific calculation here when we were thinking about dollars awarded and acres impacted. And I already mentioned earlier, you know, that this is not the full picture because there's match funding that can happen sometimes, but that's not across the board. It would take a bit more research to really understand the weight of that additional funding. Yeah, Thea, go ahead.
So the 924 million, that's state funds.
Those are the funds.
Those are state dollars.
Yeah, those are state dollars. Yep,
Okay.
Exactly.
And then the match could be other state dollars or private, etc.
Yep,
Okay,
exactly.
understand.
Federal grants. Yeah.
Oh, federal grants too, right? Thanks.
So yeah, that's a lot of information, but that's that's like all I have to say about that slide. Yeah, I guess the one other detail is just that, again, sometimes we have a dollar amount per project, but then in other cases we don't. It's just per year. Go ahead to the next slide, Megan. Thank you. And then the question here was, are these programs adequately meeting demand? And so we asked for awardee and applicant information. The majority of programs were able to share that with us. Some were not. But we were essentially able to calculate subscription rates for most of the programs. So essentially, when we say subscription rates, we're thinking about how many people applied compared to how many people or organizations or entities were awarded. So if we have 10 applicants, 5 folks are awarded, that's a 50% subscription rate, 5 divided by 10. So I just put up here some what I thought were notable highlights. The range. So first of all, I calculated subscription rates by eligible applicant. So you can see nonprofits, you know, for this program saw this level of applicant success. Tribal entities saw X rate of success. And so the range was 13 to 100%. So really across the board. 2 of the agricultural focused programs actually had a greater than 100% subscription rate, and that was because all applicants were awarded, and then a couple of those applicants actually received multiple awards. That's not, you know, the typical case for many state grant programs. We can also see that the Urban Agriculture Grant Program that was actually the program that demonstrated the widest range of subscription rates across applicant types. And so the for-profit organizations saw a 13% subscription rate. And so that is to say that a lot of people applied compared to how much funding was available to award, or compared to how many awards were given. So in some cases, that is an indication of demand for these programs. 2 programs awarded their tribal applicants at 100%. Across these 2 programs, that was 9 tribal applications, and so all 9 of those were awarded across, the years of data that were reported out on. And then it's not up on here, but I just wanted to note too that so SALC was one of those programs that saw 100% subscription rates for tribal applicants. And then to compare that to the nonprofits that applied, there was over 200 nonprofits that applied to the SALC program across the years reported, and they saw a 66% subscription rate, so much lower. And then, so that's just kind of a summary, kind of an overview of some of the different situations and some of the different subscription rates that different programs are seeing. And then I wanted to note that some programs are offering pre-applications, which are positive for the applicants because it allows them to express interest without taking all the time to submit a full application. But it makes it difficult to measure the true demand in some ways, because they aren't, in the programs that I talked to about the pre-applications, they weren't tracking those as part of the applicant pool. Okay. So slow me down if anyone wants to, but otherwise I'm going to keep going. Next question was around prioritizing equity, and there were a couple of different metrics that were used to measure this question. One was around program goals, another one was around set-asides, and then another one was around language access. And so as you can see up here, 2 of the programs were really designed around equity explicitly, in that they were benefiting specific priority communities that were outlined, and eligibility to be awarded actually depended on serving those priority populations or communities. And then there were 2 programs that seemed to have pretty clear frameworks and goals for incorporating equity into their evaluation of applicants and into their program goals. And so some of that looked like either a strong set aside or goals outlined in the program guidelines for applicants when they were reading through, and or a strategic plan, which I'll mention a little bit more in a couple slides. But these strategic plans were just tracking these goals really clearly and publicly. And then the other 4 really varied in terms of their progress. One had noted that that the program had just recently started to adopt a set-aside. It was really based on this Prop 68 requirement, and that was the impetus for doing that. And then another agency mentioned that they used an internal scoring card, and then they're anticipating equity to be a central priority in the 2025 strategic plan, so kind of up and coming. And then the other 2 noted that it wasn't really a primary focus or not incorporated at all. Go ahead, Megan, to the next slide. All right. Okay, and so then for the set-asides, the set-asides ranged from 5 to 35%, excluding those 2 programs that I just mentioned that basically required some type of prioritization of certain communities across the board. So the set-asides among the other programs ranged between 5 and 35. And we found that programs do a combination of setting their own goals and then also following predetermined funding guidelines. So that's kind of the 2 driving factors behind these set-asides. And you can see the different definitions for priority communities that were used in these set-asides. I'm seeing this up here. I'm noting tribal applicants or California Native American tribes is not listed up here. Should have put that up there too. So there was just different percentages associated with all of these different priority communities and all these different definitions. And across these 4 different communities listed up here, you can see the metric or the way to kind of measure and define these communities really varied. So a couple of them were around income, others around census tract, and one around race and ethnicity. So varied pretty widely. And then I did want to note that the State Coastal Conservancy in their application materials notes that they recognize the tools listed here on the slide that you can see, but also they acknowledge that some systemically excluded communities are not mapped and not included necessarily in this list. And they actually offer to provide guidance on other ways of demonstrating benefit. And they noted such as direct participation by community-based organizations. So just noting that flexibility and kind of openness to define things in a different way. All right, I'm moving through just a couple more slides. Okay, so another question that came out of this subcommittee that we were trying to get at in the research was around how predictable the funding is, to see, if applicants can anticipate these funding streams on a yearly basis. 3 we found had consistent annual funding on a pretty regular basis. 3 showed less consistent funding with gaps. So a couple, for example, maybe the range of data that they submitted was over 10 years, but only 3 or 4 years had funding, or 2 or 3 years had funding. So kind of sporadic. And then the other 2 programs have just completed their first round of funding and anticipate additional, but nothing confirmed quite yet. Okay, you can go to the next slide. And then the question here was around how or if programs are addressing scale and land tenure in their program design and priorities. So what we heard from respondents was that none of the programs really state an explicit preference or priority for large-scale projects or large-scale acquisitions. Then we did take the average range by program of the projects that were being funded. So you can see that range here. It really the average ranged between 211 and a bit more than 2,000 acres. And so those were, calculated across each program. And then for the programs that did report on individual projects, which, like I mentioned earlier, was not all of them, those individual projects ranged between 5 acres and then more than 10,000 acres. So again, a really wide range there. And then I wanted to note, that while none of the programs, explicitly stated a preference for large scale, the Tribal Nature-Based Solutions Program of CNRA, which is a new program, just having completed 1 year of funding, it's unique in that it gives high priority to applicants that are landless or tribal nations with 20 acres or less. So I thought that was a pretty notable point to put down and share. And then the question around tenure as well, mostly resulted in the fact that when you are either purchasing a conservation easement or acquiring land, applicants need to demonstrate the landowner's approval, right? Or a commitment to sell or allowing or supporting the project's implementation. And so in this way, secure tenure is pretty much required to apply. However, on the other end of things, once the land is acquired or conserved, in most cases, we aren't really able to see who is then working that land if we're talking about working lands and what that kind of tenure arrangement is, whether it's steeple or long-term. With the exception that one program noted that they have a goal in their funding and in their kind of criteria to provide secure land tenure for a period of no less than 10 years for beginning or veteran farmers and California Native American tribes. So I think that was the one instance where a program is actually explicitly trying to kind of get at that tenure, the tenure challenge for those communities and setting a goal within their guidelines to try and achieve that. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So, okay, that was pretty much the end of the results that I was going to report out on, but I wanted to share this additional slide here with a couple of additional details on the application structure. This wasn't really a focus of our research, but just through the responses that we got and, reading through some of the guidelines, we, just kind of gathered some interesting details about what some of these programs are doing. So the main examples that I wanted to share are up here under application structure. Excuse me. So I think I mentioned this earlier, some programs are offering pre-applications. And so that can include getting technical assistance and feedback on your project idea before actually investing all that time in a full application. And one program that wasn't able to submit their applicant data did mention, it's a pretty high success rate because of this pre-application process. So I think it's, reducing a lot of work for prospective applicants. The other one is rolling funding. So this is kind of paired with one application for all programs. So applicants are essentially applying when they want throughout the year when they're ready, and then applying to the agency, and the staff are really funneling the applications into the correct funding stream. And I think this makes a lot of sense for the agencies that have a bunch of different funding streams funding their programs. So I wanted to note those things. I thought those were kind of unique and important to share. And then the accountability note, there was a couple of organizations, but one in or agency, excuse me, but one in particular that has a really well-designed and easy to navigate strategic plan that then articulates very clearly their funding goals and how they anticipate distributing their funding over the 5-year strategic plan. And then they have objectives and different goals. One goal example is projects serving tribes or projects on working lands. And then in the data that they sent to us, they were all tagged with those goals and with their objectives. So you can see how they're really tracking the progress. And then they release annual progress reports on that strategic plan. Okay. You can go to the next slide. I think this is actually, the last one where we can kind of pause to try and digest all of that. And I have some kind of key points I just thought I would pull out to try and prompt a conversation, but I also kind of just want to pause maybe before I go through these to see if there's any questions or reflections from all of you. Okay, you ready to hear my voice some more? Great. Well, I just was kind of thinking about just kind of consolidating some topics that occurred to me throughout the research that I thought, might be helpful to just kind of share with you all when thinking about recommendations related to grants and resources. So here they are under considerations, couple things under program design. So I think one key aspect to think about is whether this subcommittee and the task force at large wants to recommend new programs versus modifying existing. So maybe based on some of what we've talked about today, and just kind of what you've learned about a handful of these programs, thought you might have some thoughts about whether or not they would be best to adapt to kind of meet land equity priorities and goals rather than creating new ones. I think the block grant to nonprofits model versus direct funding to farmers is also another kind of point to consider, especially to the point around, what was it, around 3/4 of the awards going to nonprofits and government agencies. So thinking about how that could adapt to block grants. And thinking about if there are ways to ensure that those distributed funds, get to priority communities and are serving land equity priorities, especially in the Prop 209, kind of within the Prop 209 considerations that you may remember we discussed last meeting with our legal team. So that's kind of another topic that could be considered. And then easements, I thought were important to bring up. So much of this work really depends, so much of this conservation work really depends on easements. And so I think one route to consider is how easements could potentially better serve access and equity priorities, or if there's, other mechanisms that need to be considered. And I know the topic of cultural easements has come up in your guys' conversations over the months. And then, yeah, the other points up here, the application structure is what I just mentioned on the last slide. Approach to prioritizing applicants is, of course, kind of just another pillar of all of this. And thinking to the tribal nature-based solutions example, where they're prioritizing landless tribes, may be worth elevating in your conversation. And then funding sources. So I didn't mention this as much in the presentation, but in the document, there's a wide range of funding sources that are listed across programs, and many of these programs are depending on different funding sources and overlapping funding sources. And so one route to consider is shaping those funding sources and the kind of guidelines and criteria rather than, or maybe in addition to making recommendations about individual programs. Being that was kind of a mechanism to set asides for funding streams. So that is what I wanted to share. And now I just want to open it up for all of you for, questions. You want to kind of note any gaps or just remaining information that's needed, or what you're thinking. Yeah, James, go ahead.
This is really instructive, and I'm very grateful for all this research behind this report. You had flagged it as a consideration that I want to just reinforce is around cultural easements and also community interest easements. Thinking about kind of a pathway along the lines of which Dr. Calfo was sharing with the project in, I want to say it was Scotland or something like that, but that kind of thing would be an interesting area to research or develop. I think there's like other pathways that are touching that too for this body of work, but that would be something I'd be interested in addition to cultural easements, like cultural easements, community interest easements, tenability of those. Yeah, I'll leave it there. There's a lot of material to process.
James, oh, sorry, just really quick, I had a follow-up question, if that's okay, Doria. James, to the community interest easements, do you have any like recommended frameworks that come to mind? I feel like I'm less aware of how that's being operationalized.
I mean, it would be novel here, right? Like we would be building something from scratch, but I think the closest proximate type of outcome-based process to look at would be what Dr. Calfo shared about that project around an urban renewal project. I think it was in the UK. and my recollection is that a community group that had collaborated in their interest went before kind of like a magistrate judge to ask to have that title transition to them, and um, that's something I'd be interested in exploring. It doesn't perfectly nest itself in grants and resources necessarily, but flagging it here. So yeah.
Thanks, James. Gloria, go ahead.
So I just wanted to say thank you again for all the research. I think it is important to have research and to look at what we actually have and start from there. My inclination is to look at the programs that we think are making the biggest impact, or kind of model programs, and looking at how we could adjust or expand those if need be. Some of the first thoughts that come to mind are, I wonder what a kind of uniform reporting across these programs would look like, so we could get a better, clearer picture of what the impact is. Like, I wonder if folks would be, open to the idea of having uniform matrix that are working across programs. Like, they could have other things that maybe they need to track as well, but if we could have a set of uniform matrix that go across the program, so we can better understand what the impact is, because it is a little hard to see it. There's a lot of data, but it's hard to see what exactly is happening. I think with that, if we could also look at some of the things that are good that maybe are not in all programs, and make that a recommendation to include in the programs that don't currently include it. Like, I'm unsure, but if all programs don't include land tenure as a part of their kind of process or criteria, that would be great. Or if all programs don't have the pre-application process with support, that would be a recommendation, or if we find that the rolling funding is actually a help and not a hindrance, because then people can bring their project forward as it materializes, and not, by this day we have to have it, and that's not always necessarily possible. I also do wonder, like, for the one program that allows for for-profit entities, farmers, I wonder if we could look a little deeper at what they're doing, and understand better how that's helping the farmers, and see if there's any lessons that we could learn, or kind of, again, recommendations we can make to the other programs. Yeah, those are my initial thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, Thea, go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, just building on what what you were just saying, seems like there's a couple of different umbrellas here. One is, how are we, this sort of like capacity building, or application support, structure, TA, whatever we want to call it, those types of recommendations for accessibility and greater success in funding. Maybe looking at some of those examples that had that higher success rate, meaning, how do we know we're doing a good job when we know that people who apply for the program are getting funded, and we have a number of acres that were, accessed, acquired. But then the other part, which is, it's from the state perspective, is a little bit more tricky to understand in terms of those for-profit entities and giving funds directly, and what might be types of recommendations in there. And, as of right now, with the climate bond and Proposition 4, these kinds of conversations are happening of how, what mechanisms are in place, what state agencies can help with this type of transfer. Those are questions that maybe are going to be coming out in the next 6 months or so, or less. And I don't know if that's going to match up with our timeline or not, but those are still things I think the state's grappling with. But maybe there's some pieces of these programs that are directly for applicant, for individuals that we could explore or look at and see how that could be included somehow. That makes sense. But I do like the idea of making sure that we're calling out some of those practices for accessibility in the application phase. And it's not only that, but it's also the support along the continuum while they're implementing the project, even if it is they're just buying land or able to acquire land, or maybe they're having to implement conservation practices, et cetera. They'll, support along the life cycle of the grant, which I don't know if that was in your data or not, Tessa, but I've seen that anecdotally, like heard, the importance of that type of TA or assistance.
Yeah. It wasn't really too much beyond like the cycle of the grant. Yeah. A couple did note that I know there was one reflection at one point about that longer list of grant programs where there's a lot of TA and maybe less so for direct funding to farmers. One program within this set of programs noted that they actually added a capacity building element because of applicant feedback on, hey, we can acquire the land, but without doing all of this work in advance, we can't actually ever get there. So it's definitely present.
I had another question. Was there, I'm sorry that I didn't see this, but if I did, the acreage that was reported, was there a geographic listing? Was there any geographic data reported along with that acreage, or just the total number of acreage for the state?
It was mostly basically just the total, because the awardee, and so the way that the data was reported out, we got geographic information on awarded projects, but then the acreage and the dollars were basically aggregated. And so it wasn't possible to like connect. Yeah, is that what you were asking? I think I'm.
Yes.
Okay.
But I think that this also kind of speaks to even the guest speaker at the last speaker series about how hard it is to find information. And here now we're trying to just look at some data, and because everyone does it differently or collects things differently, there's not really standardization process. It's still hard to know.
Yeah.
So it's hard to understand the impact or even know if you've positively impacted, because we really don't. So maybe that's a recommendation in there. I don't know. I'm just thinking, but something to look at standardization of this type of important data and making sure that's available going forward.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I feel like I'm like, there's a lot of data that we're looking at, but I don't really know how to interpret it, and I'm not quite sure what it's telling me because of the differences across the different programs. I would really be for drafting a clear recommendation around the data collection.
To that point, is there anything, and maybe it starts with the metrics that you had already all asked for this analysis, but are there already things that come top of mind that you would want to be part of that standardized evaluation process? So maybe geography is something that's been mentioned today, right? What are, just that way it can help us draft a preliminary language for you all to review.
At least optional demographics. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead, Doria.
I was saying to add to that, at least optional demographics, so you can understand who, and maybe also like the difference between who's applying for the grant and who will be stewarding the land, like a clarity on who's who, and then optional demographics for both?
I guess I keep thinking about how the grant programs, at least from the state perspective, how programs are created. And because there hasn't up until now been like a directive or an overarching reason to have a program or focus on agricultural land equity or get farmers having access to land, many times these programs are just, they're in different agencies, they're serving a different purpose, they're responding to different legislation like Proposition 68 or others. So it's a very specific focus and there's flexibility within the program, but there's not like an overarching goal or vision to address what we're looking at here. So it makes it hard to like match those things up. Maybe there's a recommendation in there, though, I don't know, to make it more of a cohesive way of approaching agricultural land equity in that way through grants and research, through grants and funding.
Yeah, go ahead, James.
It's feeling like I agree with a lot of the sentiments that were just shared. And it feels like one thing that this is less of like a policy recommendation about which grants are working and how they should change, and more a recognition that we do need like a different metrics for kind of accountability of impact for some of these different grants and resources. And like I think one way to figure out how to capture some of that will be kind of working backwards from some of our definitions around what we hope to see with the policy recommendations. And also I think being able, like, we need to be able to like have accountability for, especially for like future projects, like future grants to, yeah, I guess, what am I trying to say here? I think there should be some combination of like qualitative and quantitative standardized assessment of impact of different grants moving forward, but as like for in general, but especially if it ends up being connected to something that the task force is like putting together in the future, if that happens.
And James, when you say assessment, you mean by the administering agency or
yeah
otherwise? Okay.
yeah or some, there has to be some body that has the capacity to do the kind of, because I know this is grants and resources, but when we've talked so much about how there's like this holistic view that we need to take around impact and what's happening on an environmental level, on a socioeconomic level, on an intergenerational wealth building level, on a livable wage, like on all these different levels. And I think insofar as we're able to put some kind of measurement tool in place to monitor that and track that over time, that's going to be really important. I know that's bigger than grants and resources, but it feels important.
Go ahead, Doria. You all can just jump in freely.
So I was thinking that, just reflecting on what you said, Thea, about how a lot of these programs were kind of created in response to legislation or something like that. There was a directive that had it, the programs created. And it occurred to me that there's a directive that created the task force to make recommendations, but I wonder if we also need, as a task force, to kind of establish a directive around farmer equity, like land acquisition, so that could be a new kind of criteria that these programs could kind of fit into, kind of like the 30 by 30 was like a clear directive for the state on what they wanted to see by 3030, that a certain amount of land would be conserved. I wonder if we also need, as a task force, to clearly state what is the goal that we would recommend to be established by the legislature in order to have that kind of directive that then existing programs, other things could kind of organize themselves around. I don't know what people think of that.
I second that. I think that's a great idea. And I think having a bolded directive that is not as big as all the other policy recommendations will be very helpful for like highlighting what's most important to do.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think we're going to need to have something like that to guide those other parts going forward.
Are there other examples? I think 3030 is actually mentioned in your draft recommendations right now. Like within a recommendation, actually. I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but are there other maybe models to look at in thinking about making this type of high level goal setting around land equity that come to mind for you?
I probably have another example. In fact, but until you said that, I didn't realize that we hadn't really done that in our recommendations or anywhere else. You know, we're kind of leaning on the legislation that established the task force, but none of it says that past the task force that there will be this goal that the state could adopt. You know, none of them is a clear recommendation for that. So I don't know of another one out there that I could refer to. There probably is in other realms that are not necessarily land associated or land related. Maybe it's around housing. I know that there's some housing directives around what the state wants to see with affordable housing. I wonder if we could look at some of those and see, you know, and just clearly state what we're trying to do in terms of, you know, creating greater access to land for farmers and tribes.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dory. Maybe we need to look into housing and health realms because those are getting at more of the public, you know, public good, public benefit, and it encompasses all those other aspects that we've been talking about as a task force. It's not just the land, it's all those other pieces. It requires the land, but it isn't just about that.
Going to also quickly flag that's really helpful, and I think, you know, staff could start by just digging into some of that what's out there and sort of sharing that out as models for the task force to consider. There's also the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force, which is really built out like an entire kind of program that, again, I think is speaking a bit more to what you're all discussing, that has like a set of goals, but then it is a continued sort of continued process that is additive. So I just wanted to flag that as one other place that people could start looking. And then in relation to funding, I just wanted to also flag the California Climate Investments, right, is like the guidance document for anything funded by the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So that's a subset, I think, of what you all are talking about, but wanted to flag that again as another place that this subcommittee or the task force might want to go to consider how a set of guidelines becomes standard practice across all agencies that rely on those funds. So just wanted to put those out there.
Yeah, and when I think about setting a goal or what the task force would want to see after the fact, that alone could be a pretty big process, you know, as a task force coming to that goal. And if you all are thinking about identifying numbers like 30 by 30 is a 30% by 30 at 2030. So just flagging that I think yeah, staff, like Camille, to your point, right now we can kind of try and move this along a bit, and I think it would be really important to revisit. But just noting that the recommendation could also potentially look like directing that goal to be set, and especially if you want research behind it, or if you want to get to some quantitative number around how much land should be conserved, for example. Just noting that might be a big process and that might have to be a future project.
I mean, I don't think that we're talking about a certain number of like amount of land, because that's hard, because what's the impact of a 2-acre or 5-acre or 10-acre farm as opposed to a 500-acre farm? Is it really the acreage, or is it the impact, or is it in the access so that somebody could get started? And I do think, though, that the number of farmers and tribes that gain access could be a variable, and kind of something around, how long they're able to, kind of operate those projects. Something that gets at tenure as a measure of success or a goal, and then maybe there's also a goal around geography, that we don't want this to make this kind of impact in one location or one part of the state, but we would want it to be across the state or in different agricultural areas. I mean, I feel like we can come up with some goals that wouldn't depend on needing a whole lot of research to try to figure out and parse, like, well, how many acres and things like that. Because I do feel like it's, if you kind of roll back for why are we even doing this? It's a number of things. It's the historical lack of access, but it's also the need for new farmers, the need for land stewards, yeah. So I don't want to just ramble on, but I do feel like this is a process that would really help land our recommendations in a kind of world that could persist beyond the task force.
Great, thank you for sharing that, Drea. That's helpful.
Yeah, I agree, Dory. I think that to me, it's like we're looking at this great research. Thank you, Tessa. That has been compiled, and yet we don't have the story that we need. We're not able to understand how the impact. Not that we need to have that additional set of research, but like Dory is saying, this overarcher, like, how are we putting this within the problems that we're trying to address here? We know that we want to conserve more land. We know that we have a lot of new farmers, and they need our support. We know we have a changing climate. We know these are all the things that we know. Yet, when we don't have a cohesive umbrella to put it under, or directive, then we fall short because we don't really understand the impact. And we don't know how we're, even though we have that number of dollars and we have that number of acreage, it still doesn't tell us a story really about what's happening on those acreage, who's ultimately getting that dollars, what are they doing? We still don't have that information. And it's not because of anyone's fault. It's because those things are created with a specific direction, in a specific agency, with deliverables that are different from each other, and it's never been looked at perhaps before with the lens that we're taking. And if grant programs, bringing it back to grants, are intended to like bridge a gap, address a problem, change the situation, or increase access to land, the only way they'll be able to do that, I think, is what we're saying here, or a better way to do that is to put them underneath that focus of land access or land equity, and how, and then we can list those things that would need to be under that umbrella. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm just brainstorming here.
I think you're on it. You're on the right track there. Yeah. I think that we're so far what I'm hearing is that we would like to recommend making that the task force actually create a recommendation around a goal that this work could kind of live under and persist under and grow and develop. That could be applied to many different efforts and programs added to them as an additional goal. And we have other recommendations for like existing programs that would kind of help towards that goal, like, having more uniform metrics so we can better understand impact, and some of the other things that folks mentioned. I personally would really like to have a deeper dive with the one program that has that allows for for-profit applicants, just to understand how that program is different from the others. Seeming as though, at least farmers, not necessarily tribes, but at least farmers if they're in business, it for the most part, they're for profit. There are definitely nonprofit farmers. Don't want to exclude them, but I would like to look at, seeming as though there's only one where they can apply. I'd like to understand that landscape better.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you want to respond, Thea. This was a CDFA program. I will just mention that that was the outlier, as we could see, and there are a handful of other CDFA and other programs that do fund for-profit farmers directly for various practices. So perhaps it's the Urban Ag program or another program that you could do a deeper dive with.
We could consider starting to offer that if this subcommittee would be interested to see whether there are program staff for those CDFA programs that directly fund farm businesses, that you could have a conversation with those teams maybe and just ask them what hurdles they face, all that, the kind of questions you have. Is that something that the subcommittee would be interested to host?
I would love that. I'd love to ask them what they think is working, what isn't working, what do they think is the strongest part of their program, what would they love to add if they could. Like, I would love to ask all those questions.
Okay. Yeah, we'll see if we can mobilize that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Are there other programs or other sort of unique approaches that maybe Tessa already mentioned today that you would be interested to explore further? The other one that comes to my mind is CNRA's tribal capacity building. Is that what I'm always getting CNRAs confused with SGCs, so I apologize. Nature-based solution. That's it. That specifically prioritizes landless or tribes with less than 20 acres. That was for me another kind of interesting and relatively unique. So I just didn't know if there are other programs or related kind of unique ways of approaching this that you all would like to think more about.
I think I'd like to put that question back to the folks that led on the research. If there was a program that really stood out in terms of, that seemed to be being very successful with tribal land access or other things that you saw and you're like, this looks like a really good model. It'd be nice. It doesn't have to be a whole lot. Maybe we're looking at 2 or 3 programs max that we really want to look into. That would be great from my perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy to recommend a couple. This might be getting a little bit into work planning, so I almost want to pause slightly on that question and just kind of see if there's any other reflections that folks want to share or ideas before we do public comment and then get into the discussion around subcommittees and next steps and timelines.
I had a question. I'm sorry if I forgot, but was there a reason that we didn't do USDA programs at this time?
Yeah, so we had that one land markets and capital on the list at the beginning. They didn't end up responding and it didn't feel like a moment to bug the program lead once we didn't hear back from them. But in general, the design of this research was supposed to be focused on California programs. So that was
Okay,
what, yeah.
great. And just grants, so not loans, right? So there's very few USDA that probably would have. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, but I think that program was of interest, and even though it was a USDA program, it got on this list of 12 original programs we were going to do a deep dive on because of how unique it is in that it addresses land capital markets. So, I mean, perhaps that's on this short list of, trying to better understand kind of the interworkings of that program. You all can decide on that. So, okay, I mean, this felt like a great discussion to me. I think you all articulated some pretty clear recommendations, or at least the beginning and the kind of framework of a couple recommendations. Any other thoughts or questions before we move on?
The only thought that I had was I do wonder if there is a big enough gap to recommend a new program. And I just want to say it out loud. I would not, my desire is to not have to do that, to use an existing structure. But if there is a big enough gap, if we hear back from kind of what we're thinking of as model programs for the reasons why they couldn't do things that we would like to see them do, then maybe we also need to make a recommendation around the creation of a new program where this would be the focus. And in terms of like opening access would be the primary focus, and we would set our own, have to worry about negotiating metrics because metrics would be the metrics we need. But again, I know how much work that is, and it's, expensive to stand up new programs. So if we could use existing programs and innovate, that would be better.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. And I do think where I personally feel like things are looking is like a both and thing of like, we probably need to tweak or fold in the best working existing ones and potentially develop something new, particularly because there's an implicit there's an implicit kind of assumption for these other ones that to multiple points that people have spoken to earlier, like they have a specific directive that's kind of like steering those programs, and it's different from what our goals are. So I think we'll have to like come up with something. And just one question I would love to ask the folks who are managing different grant programs right now is like, if you could make a grant program for, to increase equitable access, like what would you do? Or like how would you like kind of like if you were to develop something new, what would be really important for you to have in there, or to make sure that that doesn't get lost? Just because I'd be really curious to hear what those folks think about that question. Like, given that they have a lot of lived experience in like, for better or worse, grant administration around these types of acquisitions and other land use things.
Okay, thanks for articulating that question. Note from someone watching. Love that question. Okay, we have that down. Yeah, and I think to your point, James, about the existing programs are designed around an implicit question. I think largely that is conservation. It's where a lot of the programs are kind of oriented around. And then as we saw in kind of the spectrum of equity goals and set-asides, there's been a lot of work to expand to try and meet some equity goals, but perhaps but then we're actually able to see the two programs that are new and were potentially designed around different goals. And there might be a fruitful comparison there to see kind of what outcomes are happening from one versus the other. All right. Anything else? I don't want to move on if anyone else has other considerations. Okay. Well, of course, we don't need to end the conversation here. You can keep simmering on it and reach out, and let's, I think, probably get into work planning, because that's where this conversation will pretty much continue.
Quick pause though. Let's see.
There we go. Public comment.
Any public comment on that robust conversation around research updates?
None on the form. Let me confirm. No raised hands. No, there's no public comment.
Okay, thank you, Camille.
Hmm.
All right, working session.
Okay. So let's see. We have some interest in maybe, I'm just trying to recap from here, like deeper dives on a couple of programs. I think that's kind of, and then of course, like trying to kind of provide a draft for all of you of those recommendations that you just articulated. Like I said, this is just a continuation. So is anything else kind of coming to mind that you want to try and incorporate into the draft recommendations? And, you know, by extension, are there topics that you want to address more in the next subcommittee meeting, which will occur after the May meeting? That's when we're kind of anticipating. So, and if there's not like additional thoughts and processing that folks want to do, that's fine. We just want to kind of put a pause here to make sure.
Is the oh sorry, go ahead, Doria. You were first.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I was just gonna say, is land tenure looking at grants related to land tenure, or is it like, I'm wondering where that slice falls, because you know, this is most of these. Yeah, it'd be interesting to do to take a look at some other grants that have a slightly different purview in terms of their like outcomes around, like, these are about easements and land access and owning land. And I do think actually doing a little bit of analysis around grant programs that work around land tenure, stability, things like that would also, I don't know if that fits best for us or for tenure, but I think there's a place to, I'd be interested in digging into that a little bit more.
Okay, that subcommittee is not currently looking at grants. Do you have any that are coming to mind, James?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, like,
Okay.
just okay. Let's see. It's gonna be a fun question.
You can think about it and come back to it.
Equip, healthy soils,
Okay.
RFSI, oh, I feel like other folks in
That's
here
helpful. Those are kind of
just, yeah, just so you know, grants around infrastructure improvement, cold storage, you know, nobody's really helping people like tap wells. Basically, like, there is a rope. I mean, all the like Western SARP grants. There's a lot. There's a lot. Actually, when you asked me to start listing some, my brain exploded a little bit, because
that's just helpful to get an idea of what you're considering to be land tenure grants. So thank you for that short list. That's good.
That makes me wonder if we shouldn't be looking at those as well and like examining like barriers to access and the problems that especially smaller farms have with trying to access those programs?
Well, I will say that was an overlapping list of the CDFA programs that we just mentioned earlier, wanting to know about direct funding to farmers or farming funding directly to farmers. So could be kind of like a 1-2 multi-purpose conversation there.
Yes,
oh yeah,
oh, sorry, just to add about 10, like CDFA certainly adjusted requirements related to tenure based on public input, and that's a conversation that the staff could talk about at our meeting. The requirements. I feel like I get that question a lot too for requirements for beginning farmer and rancher, eligibility for program funds. It seems like, James, you said land tenure. It's more like what happens after there's land.
Yeah.
I don't know. To me, land tenure is like, I mean, indirectly, you have to have some kind of tenure to access those programs, so to speak. So that's like supporting the farmer in a various ways with whatever those programs focus on, but predicated upon some type of tenure, some type of land.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I think of tenure here in the grant space, it's like there's access happens first, and then this is what happens between access and purchase, or access and other use, or access but it's what's happening once people are on the ground and like getting the resources they need to be sustainable, like economically and structurally for the long term potentially. Yeah, and I think there are just so many barriers. I mean, a great majority of the work we do is helping people navigate how to apply for these grants that are not built in with. I'm not speaking about CDFA grants in particular, but there are other grants that in general there's such a onerous kind of application process, or you need to have a certain amount of things built in ahead of time that make it that kind of make it less inclusive, particularly for the people who benefit the most.
That's it. I mean, I agree 100%. I wonder if we could capture that from based on what we were previously talking about with these sort of barriers in the process. That could be whatever grant, whether that's land acquisition or conservation practices or what have you. There could be, but that category being very important, I think, to identify those application capacity. There's a lot of, but that type of barrier.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the short list that I have is maybe a deeper dive with a couple of these grant programs, perhaps 1 or 2 of the good models that we have from the list today. And then sounds like there's some interest in talking to CDFA programs in general, EQIP and HSP perhaps, about application requirements as related to tenure, and what was the other piece? Now I'm blanking on that. Oh, and the direct funding to farmers. So the ability to do that direct funding. Then we have the goal setting question or topic that you all were discussing quite a bit. So I'm just looking at these questions here. I think as far as like a future subcommittee meeting, that might be a good topic to address, but I want to hear from you all about what you're thinking in response to these questions. And then like very much relatedly, who would you need to hear from? So perhaps these are kind of one-on-one calls with these individuals, or it's just in a subcommittee meeting that we ask folks to come on.
I'm sorry, I had an unrelated thought that I wanted to
Go right ahead.
I don't know if we were planning to do this or not, but in our report, are we planning to list these programs that we've identified, these grant programs that we've identified that actually, help with access and acquisition, with acquisition and, yeah, with acquisition? Are we gonna list them in there and make sure that it's clear to people who that we've done this work and they don't have to go do it for themselves? We can put it in one place.
Do you mean like a synthesis of the document that we sent out, or just listing these programs?
Almost like just listing them and kind of doing kind of a very broad overview of what they support. So there's just like, it becomes a tool, like the work that we did looking into them, or whatever, becomes a tool for people who are wanting to gain access because they're reading this report, right? And I don't know if that's like in an appendix or something, but if it's just lost in the documents of this process, I wonder if it'll just be lost. And kind of with that, I was also thinking that we should gather together the other programs that maybe weren't listed in there that are more around how helping folks establish their farm business or, steward land, that helps establish that kind of tenure that we were talking about. So people can have in one place, like the existing resources from the state, for this to help with this kind of thing. And then I do wonder if one of our recommendations should be, again, if we have a kind of a website page or some kind of a place where people could find it, where this mission and goals that we're talking about, where people could access this as a resource. So they don't have to go searching to find, well, where can I find money to, get irrigation from the land or to get help buying land? It's actually all in one place. Here's all the things the state has established. Does that make sense? Right.
Me, it does, yeah.
So there's a recommendation that we create such a one-stop shop of all the state resources to help farmers access land and remain on that land and build a business, farmers and tribes. And then two, for us to have somewhere where it's clearly a part of whatever our product is, so you don't have to go searching for it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
We are going to have a conversation in May just to say about kind of other products or other outputs from this process, to your point, Doria. So it might not all end up in the report of recommendations itself, but we'll hold on to what you just shared and make sure to kind of bring it into that conversation.
That's all I was asking, is I don't want to forget that piece. I think it is important that this work has been done. And I think what happens is that it's not put in a place where people can easily find, and then more people do that work over and over and over again.
Please no. Just kidding.
Does that sound familiar?
I'll say, there is already an existing example of where legislation was put into place to mandate. It's run by the state library. That it's a grants calendar, like where every time you have a grant available, you have to submit this opportunity, and it's kept in a calendar. It's a database essentially. So there is an example of where that has been done. I don't know if that's not getting quite at what you're saying, Doria, but there are examples where that's happened. In case we want to refer to that as a model of how to keep that going beyond our task force in a way that's accessible.
Yeah, I keep thinking of the kind of beginning farmers or priority farmers who come to different meetings wanting support, gaining access to land. And it's like, can we leave them a gift of this work that we've done? Here's a little roadmap that's really clear. You don't have to go, searching in the back boxes for it. It's just, there's the programs. There they are. And there's the link.
I think to the extent that you are kind of starting to come up with these things that feel like they're valuable outputs of your work that can run alongside the report, it's really helpful for you to flag them. And then, we're going to have the space to talk about some of this stuff in May. So this is one that seems like very clear. I mean, you don't have to call it a toolkit, but it's basically like information sharing that's come out of your process. So it's really helpful to see this as one space where you see that kind of value, but there might be also others as you are thinking about your work. So just wanted to flag that we can just bring that to May and make sure you talk through that.
Yeah.
Good, for sure.
I agree with all that. I think if we develop things that we feel really strong about as solutions, we should like be extra clear about highlighting those. But even if there are other opportunities that maybe don't fall in there that we can direct people to, like it's it feels very important to me that there is like an evergreen resource list that exists somewhere, probably on our landing page or something for the task force that can be referenced in perpetuity, so that folks can like, because there's going to be so many places to look, and it's okay if there's redundancy all over the place, because right now people aren't getting the information they need in general. So we're not even close to like overly saturating the space with the right information about, opportunities to kind of ameliorate all these different challenges that farmers are facing.
And I think that this is really like already clear from the survey and the conversations we've had in our various meetings. And I hear it on a daily basis. There's not clear information about grants and resources. 99% of the time when farmers call me, it's what grants are available for me as a farmer, whether that be land acquisition or otherwise. That there's not one place. I've looked, there's not one place. There's many places. Many of you are on the list of people I refer to your respective organizations, but that is a tool. That's something that could be in a recommendation, I think, or not just in the glossary, Dory, as you said. Important to list those programs, but also then maybe we can find a way to make sure it's not just in the report, or maybe there's a product there that we could also be recommending as a task force.
Yeah. Go ahead, Doria.
No, I was just gonna echo what Dia said. I hear that a lot. Like we're like, what's out there? What's available? I can't find it. And so, yeah, I think that has to be in our recommendation, some kind of a outside of our work product tool, that's explicitly for farmers and tribal groups, that makes a kind of an easy access to this information.
Yeah. And to James, your point, that is evergreen, that is maintained consistently, because we have that spreadsheet list that we've shared, but at some point that won't be updated by us anymore. So thinking through how to make that recommendation is important.
Yeah, keeping it fresh. And there's also an interesting feedback loop that is feeling like it's built here that would come of this, where there's also an interesting place to like re-engage with technical assistance around like, okay, so you go to this site, you actually see the resource, but then it's like, maybe I need support still, right? Like, okay, I know this grant exists, but I need help with, putting the financials together to be able to access it, or whatever the eligibility requirements might be. And so being able, I don't think it needs to like also have TA, stuff necessarily, but it could. But I just think it fits well with the kind of, I guess what I'm saying is it lends itself to the broader kind of intersectional approach that we're taking around problem solving for some of these things.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just echo that I also get this question a lot. And I think a centralized database, that exists for like nonprofits to search for grants, so for it to be a more publicly accessible resource that you can search by eligibility criteria, and kind of see what you might be able to apply for, would be really valuable for folks. And if it was kept up to date, and I like James' idea that there could be categories like grants and like technical assistance, or like multiple different kinds of categories where folks can search for what is available to them, because right now it's totally true. It's like you go to one organization, they have one list, they might keep it updated, they might not. Another organization is trying to compile the same thing. A lot of organizations and service organizations are trying to keep on top of this in their own way. But it would be really nice to just be able to direct folks towards some centralized system for resources, grants, technical assistance. That'd be awesome.
Got it. Thank you. All right. That's a lot, and we haven't even gotten to working groups yet. So I think we can go to the next slide unless anyone wants to add anything before we do. Megan's like, go, go. We have, yeah, okay, you can work through those. That's funny. I don't know why that's like that. Okay. So with all of that, I mean, that gives staff, I think, a lot to work on, a lot to send back to you all, and probably a pretty easy setup for the next subcommittee meeting. I put this working group slide up here to remind you all of the other topics that are being addressed. First, we have the tax laws and incentives. That's Leah and James. That meeting is actually scheduled with a CPA who works specifically with farmers and ag businesses. So that meeting is next week, I believe. I don't have it off the top of my head. Maybe it's this week. And hopefully next subcommittee meeting or on the quarterly meeting in May, you all may have some things to share with the task force members as far as the recommendations related to tax incentives that exist. Yes, Thea?
Is that meeting one of the part of the public speaker series, or this is a non-public meeting? Is that a
non-public? It's just with the working group members.
Oh, bummer. Anyway, okay, I look forward to the report then.
Well, we can always, depending on how that call goes, if there are things that you feel you would really like all your task force members to hear, we can always schedule a speaker presentation with someone who has value to add. So it doesn't preclude that option if people do want to make that and extend that invitation.
But this format, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's all.
Just that this format will be a little more conducive to really workshopping some ideas and asking some difficult questions and trying to get into the nitty-gritty of the actual line-by-line recommendations. So that's the goal for that meeting. But Thea, you can send questions. I know it's better to be in the conversation, but please feel free to send questions if you have them.
I'm sure Leah and James will have it all handled.
And then we have financing. There hasn't been a ton of work on this in this subcommittee. To the point earlier, we've been focusing more on grants rather than loans. So this is a question for James and Doria. If you want to pick up this work and take it in a specific direction, that is up to you. We also can acknowledge that we can't address everything and just, you don't have to feel pressure around that. Here are a couple ideas on the slide that you could choose to address. And Zach Duchenet's presentation that was from the speaker series, he talked a bit about his ideas related to a farmer pension fund, and philanthropy was a part of that. So let me pause there and you guys can think about that for a minute. And then the third one is the grant program outcomes. So we had a really great full subcommittee conversation today about that topic specifically. But Thea and Doria, if you feel like you want to follow up on this conversation in a deeper way, or you want to get together, we can set that up.
Yeah, and have the call set up, by the way, Tessa, for that. So that could be part of the call that Doria and Thea do have set up.
Oh, great. Okay. Okay, so we can just add it to the agenda.
Yeah.
I was going to say too, though, this working group, depending on what the rest of the subcommittee thinks, could be, Doria and Thea could be the ones leading those deeper dives that were noted earlier about those grant programs, if you all feel like you have capacity for that and that's of interest.
I mean, maybe we could use it as a time to try to begin drafting the goals that we were talking about, those overarching goals. It's always easier to edit someone's ideas than to come up with them in a meeting. So we kind of sat down and did a dirty draft of what that is, and they would be outcomes, right? Outcomes that we would be looking for from a grant program that was focused on the goal of increasing access for farmers and tribes. I don't know what you think about that, Thea.
Sounds great. I think that's on our calendar this week.
Yeah.
It is. So that sounds great. I've made a note of that, and I'll be sure that's a place we can start that conversation. Thank you.
Okay, great. So then I guess coming back to financing, Doria, now that you have this other piece in your mind that you'll be investing time in, yeah, I just want to have, kind of open it up to James and Doria to see what you all want to do with that working group.
I am deeply interested in the financing, and I am stretched so thin. So I'm just like, is there a way that we can fold the financing piece into like this meeting instead of like trying to have another one-off to bring it back to this? Like just like, let's just have the financing. I mean, or financing is, I'm gonna put that under resourcing, but I know there's also like a finance. Isn't there a finance subcommittee?
I don't think so.
No. Okay. Sorry. I'm getting so many things mixed up. But let's just talk about it as part of this group if we can, because we've got the regular meeting, we've got the subcommittee meeting, and now we have the working group meetings, and it's quite a many of meetings. I think I need to bow out of like a working group finance meeting. If it can at all be folded in, that would be my preference. And if not, let's do it.
Understood. Thanks.
I like this because I want to be a part of that. Or I was looking forward to the report out and to discuss it, but yeah, I want to engage on that.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely make that like an agenda item for a future subcommittee meeting. And what we can do is we also have David Mancera's presentation. We have Zach Ducheneau's presentation. So maybe we can combine some of the things we've already heard and then use this subcommittee space to dig into those different models that were discussed and see if there's ideas that you all would like to move forward as recommendations or as models or something like that. Okay, that's clear. We can make that part of our plans for the subcommittee.
It doesn't have to be like a formal presentation or anything, but if I can answer any questions as well, wearing my community development financial institution hat, I'm happy to do that too.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, that's clear. I think that takes us pretty nicely into work planning, which I think is on the next slide, or this may be it. Yeah, you can go back. This is fine.
You wanted me to stay here?
Maybe go back to the working groups just for that information to stay fresh. Yeah, so I think we have a lot to develop, and yeah, Megan and Camille, feel free to jump in here too if work planning ideas are occurring to you. What I'm thinking about right now is that each subcommittee basically has one or maybe max two more subcommittee meetings over the lifespan of the task force, and probably one to address new ideas based on the timeline. So sounds like we're honing in on financing for the next one, which will happen after May. And perhaps getting into the details of what the working groups are kind of aligning around and coming up with, so that as a subcommittee, then you can work those ideas into the draft. I think in the interim outside of that subcommittee meeting is maybe when those grant conversations would happen. That's maybe just what's happening in my mind right now, fresh. We can kind of think about it a bit more, I guess, after this meeting. But that's what's occurring to me. And I think that's important for the subcommittee members to all have in their mind, that we really have like one more meeting this summer before the August meeting to dive into new content.
Do we ever kind of take a good look at any recommendations that are currently in the draft that are specific to grants? And just make sure that there's things that we don't want to edit or add?
Yes, definitely. I think that in some ways was going to be part of the meeting today, but we actually kind of indirectly, I think, at least from my view, answered or you all responded to some of the recommendations that are currently in the draft. One that occurs to me is, I think, I'm not remembering the exact words, but there are a couple of grant programs that are essentially proposed in the draft right now. And so, you know, the way that what everyone shared here today can be integrated into the draft is almost just building out those recommendations that already exist.
It would be great to actually like identify those, pull them out, and then given what we know, what we learned from being in the subcommittee, how would we adjust those recommendations? And then present that adjustment back to the group.
Yeah. Yeah, that could be something that we do in the next subcommittee meeting as well.
Is there a way, just to that point, Doria, is there a way that staff could do that work now and it could be part of basically like briefing materials for the subcommittees in advance of May? Because we're always open to ideas about how to facilitate your discussions, right? To help get you the material you'll need to really move your ideas forward.
Yeah.
It sounds like what you're requesting is if we can kind of do a bit of that structural work of showing you the patterns in the report, then you can come ready to like talk about those pieces in May. Does that sound?
Yeah, like what it occurs to me is if I can't remember which recommendations and like overlap with this grant, like proposing new grants. And it would be good to know, you know, is there an opportunity to actually, you know, fulfill, instead of creating a new program, use an existing program, but add different components or something like that? Or is there, you know, like what, or how can we use what we've just learned about all the grants that currently exist to inform that recommendation so we're not just blindly creating something new without learning from growing what already exists?
Yes, 100%. I think so. Probably to your point, Camille, what you were just saying, the next meeting that we have can actually be discussing draft recommendations that incorporates everything you just mentioned, Doria. So we can kind of give you those line by line recommendations, and then yeah, you all can weigh in, wordsmith, whatever needs to happen. And maybe that happens in May. Maybe that happens in the subcommittee meeting. We'll just kind of have to take a step back and look.
And maybe could you also help us draft these additional recommendations that we have been talking about here around data, like uniform matrix from existing programs? And I think James had a recommendation around that. The one speaker who came,
David Mansura.
right, I'm so spacing his
Yeah.
name.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
and as potential additional recommendations to add to the draft.
Yep, definitely. Yeah, I guess what I was trying to say is that where it makes sense to draft new ones, we'll do that. And then where it makes sense to incorporate what you all were sharing today into an existing recommendation already in the report, we'll probably do that. And so then we can bring, you know, all of that new language to this space and talk through it.
That's great.
I'd also like to highlight that it seems that some kind of response to SB 524 is something that we'll need to address. And I'm wondering if that's happening. I know the meeting to kind of get the background on it is on the 18th, but it definitely feels squarely within grants and resources, but I'm not sure if we wanted to hash it out here or with the full task, full force of the force. So just flagging that.
That's a good question. Yeah. I think what, I think from a staff perspective, and tell me if this feels like it would work as for task force members as well, that subcommittee to explore this very particular kind of opportunity, right? This very particular language, to bring that exploration, that discussion into the main meeting and to have you all then contribute in that space, knowing what you know as subcommittee members, right? I think it's kind of like I guess you're sort of tasked with bringing with you to your various conversations you're having in the space of the task force and its work, the knowledge that you have as members of this subcommittee. So maybe that's not the most satisfactory answer, but maybe what it is just that what you do know and the research that you have done and learned about, to carry that into your other interactions to make sure those observations are part of the process. Does that make some sense? If there are ways to kind of formalize that, then we can think with you about how to make that a bit more of a formal dialogue.
I have a
I think
question.
that
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just I don't know exactly how to address it because there's like a question mark here, right? Like SB 524 isn't real yet, but Prop 4 is.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how we want to kind of address like both of them call us out. One of them is official, one of them is pending, but they're intertwined. So just kind of flagging that as well.
Thank you. We will have that space to consider those further in the May meeting too.
Yeah, right. That's true.
And I think if there is like a grant feedback part of that we should look at, that could actually happen later in the year. I know it's weird, but so we've got the AB 524 like meeting thing next week. And then there's also, we're going to talk about it in May. And then maybe in between then and August would be a good time to tee it up. But in some ways, it'd almost be better to wait until after we find out what happens with that bill to then sort through kind of stuff. And I know we'd also talked about maybe wanting to have our own bill as a part of these recommendations. So yeah, I think like everybody's thinking about it. We've got the dedicated space. It's going to go to the whole task force, and we should put a pin in it for our subcommittee group to revisit it kind of perennially throughout the year.
Okay. Yeah. Well, to your point, in May, everyone as a full task force will talk about AB 524. And so then as a subcommittee, as this grants and resources subcommittee, you all can think through just in that May meeting, what parts you want to bring into your next subcommittee meeting as a group. So yeah, thank you for kind of mentioning all of those pieces. We'll do our best to thread them together and not have redundancy throughout the subcommittees, and of course, foster that collaboration so you all aren't having the same conversations without each other. I think I'm just looking at the time. I think we need to wrap up and look at public comment again.
So as of now, there is no public comment in the forum, and I'm seeing no public comment in the Zoom room.
Okay.
I believe we have general public comment after this as well. So again, there's general public comment. Is there anyone who would like to provide public comment on anything not on the agenda, not on today's agenda? I am seeing none.
All right. I always jump into public comment and then realize that sort of like ends the conversation. So if anyone wants to make any closing remarks, I think we could still do that, Megan. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, we're just a couple minutes from closeout anyways,
Okay.
but any final reflections,
Yeah.
closing comments, and we were just talking about these upcoming meetings, so they're up on the screen for you here. It's our last slide anyway. Well, I will just remind my lovely subcommittee members here that if you haven't already replied to a message from me from last week asking for your schedules for the end of May into June to schedule subcommittees, I'm going to start hunting you down. No, I'll call you probably tomorrow morning. It's getting a little late right now, unless you wanted to quickly message me after this meeting or jump on the phone. But I'm going to start trying to follow up with all of the other task force members by tomorrow at the end of the day so that we can have a schedule looking into June. Whew, can't believe it, but we're getting booked out. So that's what's coming up.
I'll just add on to that, friendly reminder to please send your travel plans for the May meeting to me as soon as you can. That'd be great.
Yeah, we need to start booking some flights and accommodations. Phew. Okay, way to close out your Monday, everyone. Getting that week going strong. Thank you, Tessa. Thanks for guiding us through all of that robust, delicious research. And thanks everyone for all of your considerations. We will be circling back around with more soon.
Yeah, thanks everyone for the good
Thank
conversation.
you. Bye.
Thank you for our
everybody.
work. Bye.
Bye.
Oops.